Hello, this is Jane Doherty, and today on our next episode of Inspirational Women in Neuroscience, we are joined by Baroness Greenfield. She's an impressive academic and truly inspirational in all she does. Her fields of study on the brain range from consciousness, neurodegeneration, identity, and how technology leaves its mark on the mind. Her academic accomplishments are unmatched, and her impact on the field of neuroscience goes quite deep. We are truly lucky to have you here today. Baroness Greenfield, welcome.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Jane.
Thank you for being here. So let's just start at the beginning. What got you interested in neuroscience, or what sort of sparked this passion for you?
I come from a very unusual background, I think, in that when I was at school, I hated science, and so what I chose for what's called in England advanced levels, or A levels, which are the exams that you take between the ages of 16 and 18. I gave up science entirely, so I did Latin and Greek and ancient history and pure maths, so what's called classics and maths. And then when I applied to go to Oxford, where in those days you needed to do a special exam, I offered Latin and Greek. So I'd never thought of myself as a scientist, and what really fascinated me was more what I would now see as the human mind. I didn't articulate it like that in those days, but it was what made the individual, why wars started, why people fell in love, all those kind of big questions you ask when you're a teenage girl. And for me, the ancient world of Rome and Greece actually went some way to exploring those questions in a way that, looking at the Spirogyra or whatever it was, or the amoeba, never did it for me. So I never saw myself as a scientist. I hated science. I thought it was just rather boring. There was no room for creativity or imagination. You just had to learn a load of facts, whereas Latin and Greek offered the chance to explore the human condition. And then when I went up to Oxford, I chose to study philosophy, but then discovered that it was very dry. It was all about language in those days. And I remember sitting in the library in Oxford reading a chapter, you won't believe this, on the definite article. So someone had written a whole chapter on the, yeah? And I thought, no, this is the ultimate in, so I want to spend my limited time on this planet, thinking and agonizing about the. So I then changed to what was, in those days, a very new subject called psychology, and got much more interested, not so much in the behavior, but in the physical brain and the physiology. So I tended to take the options that included those sorts of things. And then my tutor, because in Oxford colleges you have tutors who are kind of like your mentors and look after you. And she said, I think it would be a laugh if you were a scientist, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And in those days, it might sound strange now, in these very strict days when you have to have everything correct and all the boxes ticked and everything is formulaic. Certainly the spirit, and certainly in Oxford, though it was then, was of the gifted amateur and doing things for a laugh and having fun. And there was a certain intellectual arrogance that assumed that whatever you chose to do, you could do, and they put a premium on enthusiasm and motivation rather than questioning your ability to do it. So she said, I think it'd be a laugh if you were a scientist. So in that spirit, I was dispatched to the pharmacology department and saw a very nice head of department called Professor William Peyton, sadly now and inevitably long gone. And he was a great smoker of his pipe, and he sat there smoking his pipe behind his desk. And he said to me, so do you know what a millimolar solution is? And as you might be aware, that is the equivalent of saying to someone, have you heard of Shakespeare, or can you read? Yeah? And I said, frankly, no, whilst lighting up a cigarette myself. We both then talked about how bourgeois these non-smokers were and so on. And then he said, oh, well, never mind, you can tell us about Homer and the coffee breaks, And that's how I was admitted to do a PhD course in pharmacology, where I had no chemistry, none. And as I say, it was done almost as a lark, as we say in England. It was just a sort of, but I was just fascinated, and I think why I'd hated science at school was because everything seemed already known, and these were clear, and you just had to learn these facts. And let's be brutal, facts on their own are pretty boring. I don't know if you have in the States a game called Trivial Pursuits, but that's not up there with the Nobel Prize. It's just a question of knowing facts. Or we have in England pub quizzes where you have to know facts about things. But again, no one puts a premium on that as the intellectual pinnacle of human, knowledge. So just knowing facts is not really that impressive or that interesting or exciting. It's how you join up the facts and how you use them to develop ideas. And I think the way I've been taught science was the former. And now when I was at university and when I was at Oxford in a lab where things weren't known and you had to look out for things and see patterns and see how things might connect, that's what really then got me hooked. And I an aside, you'll often find that, especially you're female, that people tend to patronize you and so on. And when I was first in the lab, there was this postdoctoral person who was Australian, a large Australian guy who, was out of central casting for the chauvinist Australian. and he kept telling me I was a square peg in a round hole and what on earth was I doing there. And I think I learned a valuable lesson there that I'd recommend to others, that you mustn't let people see that they're getting to you. Yeah. And then in the end, so, if you want to cry or moan, just go somewhere else and do it. Don't let them see that they're achieving, being able to intimidate you. And I always remember when I then won a scholarship the following year on the basis of my work for that first year, how I went in and just triumphantly slammed the letter, as happened in those days, acceptance, this award letter, slapped it down in front of him. And I'd never felt, life had never seemed so sweet, I tell you, to this bully. Yeah. It's very low motives. That was my main feeling of pleasure, not getting this thing awarded, but showing this guy, what I was, how he was wrong. That was a lovely feeling.
I can imagine. Yeah. So, how have you dealt with sort of? You talked about people patronizing you for being a woman.
Yeah.
How have you? You've obviously been so successful in your field. So how have you dealt with that by getting pushback just because of your gender?
Well, I think there's two ways in which women perhaps get a rough ride compared to men. One is to be patronized, the other is to be bullied. That's not to say that men aren't patronized sometimes or bullied sometimes. Of course they are. But I think the temptation for a man to do it to someone who's junior, if they're female, is even more increased. You have to call it out, I think. So that's to say, if someone bullies you, again, you mustn't crumple or cry in front of them. That's exactly what they want to achieve. It gives them a feeling of power. The best thing you can do, and this I learned from my mum, who was on the stage and was very kind of used to this, used to men trying to come on tour and things, is you laugh at them. If you laugh at someone, and I would say that with harassment as well, actually, that is all this fuss at the moment about, how women have a tough time. A very good defense is to laugh. If you can laugh at them, that immediately diminishes them. Immediately. I mean, it's a tough thing to do. If you can't do it, then go off with someone else, a friend of either gender, and sit there and laugh behind their back at them. And then that puts going. But laughing to someone, if you is bloke, that's
yeah. And you mentioned you mentioned that you learned that from your mother. I was just wondering, who were your other role models, or I guess like people you looked up to who helped you in your career?
Sure. Well, let me first say about my mum, because she was 90 a few weeks ago, and she's really doing very well.
Congratulations!
Yes, it's a shameless plug now on Amazon, on UK Amazon at least. I don't know if it's in the years. She's actually written a book which is out there on Amazon called Wartime, Peacetime, My Time, by Doris Greenfield. Her real name's Doris, but she adopted her stage name of Doris. She obviously thought Doris was too ordinary, so she's called Doris. Yeah. So by Doris, and it's all about her in the war and how she went out with American GIs and this sort of thing. So, when they were over in England, that's really. They married my father, who was Jewish, and the prejudice they had to put up with because she wasn't, and yeah. So I think it's a good read because it shows the tectonic plates of prejudice of class and of age and of religion, and all those things that we're still dealing with. Anyway, so she's great. The reason she's such a good role model is I was brought up just to be myself and not to be like other people, and just be proud that you're who you are and to respect individuality in others, and just, and that's those kind of values, even though we had no money, I learned that money really was irrelevant to actually having a moral compass and, and having a set of values which she installed, above all to have fun. Again, anyway, so she was one. Then there was Uncle Jane Mellenby, who was my tutor, who said, it'd be a laugh if I was a scientist. She's obviously got a lot now to answer for. Yeah. And so there's her. Then there's a male role model, not necessarily role model, but mentor called John Stein. And he is the person I'll use as a sounding board, this tough love. He actually lectured me at one stage, and I got to know him after when he was my lecturer. His brother is the more famous Rick Stein. He's a great, very famous seafood chef in the UK, at least. And he doesn't seem to mind the fact his brother's a billionaire and on the TV and so on, and he just carries on being interested in the brain and working in Oxford. So he's another one who's very unworldly. I think my biggest role model of all, really fantastic. I don't know if you've heard of her. She was called Rita Levi-Montalcini. Have you ever heard of her?
I haven't. No.
Okay, check her out. No, okay, well, check her out. So she was born, I think it's about 1900 or so, 1903, somewhere around about that time. She was born in Italy, and she was Jewish. And growing up in Italy, as you'll know, under the fascist regime, even though she qualified as a doctor under the Mussolini regime, because she was Jewish, she was forbidden from practicing medicine. So what she did was to set up, it gets better. She set up in her kitchen, a laboratory in her own home. And the work that she then did in her own home, when she was forbidden, that actually led to her winning the Nobel Prize. Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing.
Check her out. Yeah, and if you look at pictures of her, she lived to be over 100. And she was really beautiful, even in her older age, really elegant, her hair swept up in a chignon and a real nice smile. And she was in the equivalent of the House of Lords, the Senate of Italy. But she is, if anyone was a role model, how can she not be? So it's Rita, R-I-T-A, and Levi, L-E-V-I, hyphen, Montalcini, Montalcini. And so I'm amazed that she's not the kind of role model of all young women everywhere who want to do science. Her story is a remarkable one. And she had this lovely quote. She said, above all, do not fear difficult moments. The best comes from them. Yeah. And when you think that this is someone who is being persecuted because of who they were, their ethnicity and religion, and she adopted this lovely, optimistic attitude and then won the Nobel Prize. Being a woman scientist, and there's not that many anyway that do that, but to do it out of such adversity at a time in the middle of the last century when women were still struggling really for any kind of equality. When you think of all that, what an achievement that was. Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like you've really followed in the footsteps of your role models with your mom having a book out and being in the House of Lords. So I know you have published a number of books, and I actually just read your book Mind Change, and I thought the ideas in there were absolutely fascinating. So would you mind just maybe explaining to our audiences here what that book was all about and what your findings were?
Okay, so this book was written in 2014, which in terms of modern technologies is actually a long time ago now. It's 3 years ago, which given the pace of change of technologies, when you think that Facebook really was only introduced in about, 2006, 2007, and how now it's a way of life for so many people, it's different. Anyway, so although I primarily work on Alzheimer's disease, I am obviously across most things relating to the brain because I had to teach it to medical students at Oxford for 20 years. So I have a kind of wide overview of issues relating to the brain. And one day in the House of Lords in 2009, we had a debate actually on child pornography on the internet. And the etiquette in the House of Lords is when you're in a debate, you focus your contribution on the area that you're an expert in. And so I wasn't an expert on law and pornography, but I thought the angle I would take from my speech was that as a neuroscientist, I knew, as all neuroscientists know, the brain adapts to the environment. And therefore, if the environment is changing radically, which arguably is, if your environment is one that's dominated by a screen, then we might not be surprised that people will think and feel differently from previous generations. I just say differently. Whether it's good or bad is obviously to debate and discuss. But I just said this very simple syllogism, and the world went mad. It was amazing. I was on all the media. Baroness says Greenfield says computers rot the brain. All these other press, etc. And but it did get up there, and because of that, even though it wasn't in my area, I started to read and think and talk about it a lot more, because I suddenly realised it was important even back then in like 2010 by that time. And then I got approached by Random House, who said, would I write a book on it, which I did, and that's Mind Change. And the reason it's called Mind Change is I draw analogies with climate change, in that both are unprecedented, both are global, both are controversial, but above all, both are multifaceted. Climate change, as far as I understand it, isn't just one problem. It involves, water issues and alternative energy and so on, and how we carbon, so on. So there's lots of different questions. And similarly with mind change, and this is what I explore in the book, it's not simply, is it good or bad? Are computers good or bad? Because it's a whole new lifestyle, which means it really breaks down into lots of different issues. And so I divided it up into 3 or 4 chapters on social networking sites and identity and how it impacts on different aspects of that. Then video games and how it impacts on attention span and addiction and risk and so on. And then search engines and how that impacts on how we differentiate information from knowledge, reading, whether we read or not, and so on. So each chapter is a different aspect of this multifaceted issue that I called Mind Change. And so that came out in 2014. And so I'm glad to hear that it's still alive and well and still getting a copy. So
yeah. And you mentioned earlier about that your in 2009 what your speech got some pushback. So I'm wondering, I mean, like any person who makes public an idea or study, how in your career have you learned to sort of deal with skepticism or pushback of your work and findings?
Oh, of course. Well, it's natural. I mean, that is what science is about. If you have a new idea, is it likely that everyone's going to say, what, you're right, and roll over and accept it? Of course not. Now, here we have several issues. The first is that science, anyway, is by nature actually conservative. That's to say, most scientists have worked on a certain idea all their lives. They've adopted a certain set of rules or way of seeing something. And therefore, you meet a lot of sales resistance when you suggest something different, because if they've invested a lot of time and energy and thought into something, and then a new idea comes along, they're not going to drop what they've been working on for years and just swallow your idea, just like that. So it's healthy and it's normal, but it's challenged. And the whole point of peer-reviewed journals, for example, is that you have other scientists challenging what you're saying, and you have to defend it and justify it in order to establish a way forward. And that, for me, is utterly legitimate, and you welcome it, and it's utterly not surprising. What saddens me is 2 things, is when, even in the face of all information, people still stick to their old idea. And that's something that has been called dogma. A man called Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Politics of Science Revolution, where he said, in science you have this dogma, everyone believes in a certain way and works on it in a certain way, but then slowly anomalies creep in, and initially people try and put them under the carpet or make excuses for them, but the anomalies keep coming. So in the end you can't ignore them, and you have to accept that your paradigm, your way of seeing something, isn't accurate. And that's called a paradigm shift. Incidentally, I think that's happening now in the field of Alzheimer's. We can come on to that in a minute, where you say, look, enough already. This isn't working. Yeah, that's the first thing that saddens me, is when people won't be open to new ideas. And the other is, of course, when it gets personal, when people think that by insulting you personally is the same as true to it. And that, of course, can happen especially if you're a woman. And with that, you just have to call it out, or not let it get to you. What you mustn't do is, frankly, like your president does, is answer back and try and fight back, so it gets into a rather rude, slanging match. I think that demeans everyone. Sorry to insult the head of state, but
no.
I think I don't know. I make no apologies, really. I think it's we say, there's a saying, if you're familiar in the States, with it, you play the ball and not the man. You don't attack a person, you attack an idea. But attacking someone at a personal level is, I think, very shabby. It's something I don't like to do. So if people do it to me, then you just ignore it. If people want to spend their time on this planet being vicious and spiteful and nasty about other people, then let them. They're not worth wasting energy on, frankly, rather than trying to get angry about it. So, but I'm very happy to discuss all the science and why. And if people come up with alternative ideas or thoughts, then bring it on. That's how we make progress. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really what science is all about, is asking questions and staying curious and challenging what you know to be true, to seek what's really doing the work.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the ideas surrounding Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration have been changing. Do you mind elaborating on that a bit?
Yeah. So this is what I work on, and this is again a plug if you want to look on the website for Neurobio, which is my company, which I've started, where we're approaching a new approach to Alzheimer's, what people like to call disruptive, meaning it's a paradigm shift and that it's questioning existing dogma. Now, there hasn't been a new drug for Alzheimer's since 2002. So with all the muscle of the pharmaceutical industry, it's clear that something isn't right, that we're doing something wrong. And my own view is we have to really rethink it, and that's what I've done. And as it's happened over the last 40 years, I've been working on the brain, rather like a jigsaw puzzle. Bits have come together to build up into a story that actually makes sense. And like all jigsaw puzzles, the more pieces you put in, the faster it is, because the picture is clearer and clearer. And that's what we're doing now. And so since 2013, I've started my own company when we got investment, and was now where we are, 2017, and still going and growing. And I'm really having fun. I'm really enjoying it, doing this. So our approach is to, instead of saying, oh, well, let's look at a post-mortem brain and see how it's different from a control brain, which is what most people have done, where they target, therefore, something called amyloid, which tends to characterize the Alzheimer brain. But sadly, it also characterizes the healthy brain. So that can't be the real villain. What we've done is say, well, why is it that only certain brain cells are vulnerable? What's special about them, and so on? And in brief, our answer is that they come from a different part of the embryo and are therefore very different literally from birth, i.e. before birth. And the ability they have is to grow again. And if the brain is damaged, therefore, if they are damaged and they try and grow, they will mobilize mechanisms that are actually toxic in the mature brain, which are great in an embryo but are just not great in an adult. And what we found is the molecule, the signaling molecule, we call it, the messenger molecule that sets in train this inappropriate activation of development. And we've identified it. We've shown it's higher in Alzheimer brains. We've shown we can measure it in blood, so that's hoping leads into a diagnostic. We've identified the receptor, the little target it shakes hands with, and we've identified a drug that could intercept it. So so it's exciting times. That's what we're working on.
So just to clarify, so it's what you found is that an inappropriate activation of this sort of embryonic cell is what's triggering the toxic.
It's an embryonic mechanism, not an embryonic cell. They're special. They're cells that are deep down the brain, but it's something that they do when they are growing in the embryo that they stop doing in adults. And if you damage the brain, if you damage other parts of the brain, like with a stroke, then you get, as you know, recovery or partial recovery of function. Whereas if these cells are damaged, what they will do is try and grow again. And the very thing they're trying to do is, in fact, the worst thing they could do.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And you mentioned...
Yeah, go on.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so the dream, and it does require we know the basic mechanism, but this is our dream, is that if you had a blood test that we think we're developing, the problem with Alzheimer's, it comes on 10 to 20 years before you get the cognitive, the memory problems. So this means by the time you've got memory problems, you've already got 20 years of neuronal cell loss. So small wonder that drugs you then take do very little to stabilize that cell loss, but they can only slow it down. Whereas if you had a blood test that alerted you 10 to 20 years earlier that the problem was starting, even if you took an existing drug now, it would be beneficial because you'd start it much earlier. But even better, imagine if you could take a drug that stopped any more cells dying That on its own would be great because if you already had symptoms, you could at least stabilize them. They wouldn't get any worse. But now imagine the two things together, that you go to the doctor for a routine blood test and he or she says, well, I'm afraid you've got an elevated marker and in 10 or 20 years you're going to get these symptoms. But the good news is we have a drug that stops any more cells dying. So if you take that drug now, even though you have no symptoms, then you'll never have the symptoms. Yeah. So that's our package. That's the dream.
That's amazing.
Well, it will be. That's what we're trying to do, yeah? And that's very different from just taking a drug to slow things down. It's actually going to the heart of the problem, and it would mean that people would then have a package of a routine blood test every year or so, like we all have for different things, routine blood test, and then, if need be, a medication that you took daily, which some people might not like, but hey, look at the alternatives.
Yeah. Well, happy I'll be growing old in a future like that.
yeah. So anyway, that's the dream. So and that's how I feel very privileged and blessed to even have the chance to work on this, because it's something that's gradually come together over the years, and now I feel I'm being given a real chance to see if it can be made to work on a practical level, and as well as learning some really exciting things. Having been an academic all my life, having been a university scientist all my life, now dealing with businessmen and the real world. It's so funny, actually. I'm finding it really, really funny. I'm learning a lot, and the whole thing in life is actually to always be learning new things. It's yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you find most compelling about working for NeuroBio and sort of heading that?
I think it's in the private sector, which that is. I think it's things are much easier in a way to achieve, so long as what you are doing gets people excited and they buy into it. In universities, you have to apply for grants where the funding rounds are very long. It takes a long time to get them processed. There's lots of committees. People tend to be rather risk averse, and because academics aren't paid as much as in the private sector, they tend to see their power in other ways, which is through rather kind of tiny little, power grabs of things. Kissinger, your great diplomat, had a lovely quote. He said, "University politics is so spiteful because the stakes are so low," which I thought was a very good quote. But it's a bit like that. There's a lot of bickering and gossip and backstabbing and back channels and all the rest of it as like a sort of cesspit. Whereas when you're simply there, and it's very simple, if you are making money, everyone will back you, and if you've got a good idea, people will back you, and they like to try out new things. And I think certainly in the current climate, I wouldn't have said this 40 years ago when I was starting, when then the brightest and best stage in universities, and they had much more freedom, and the industrial world was just that. There wasn't the biotech issues and the spin-outs that you can have now. Now I think the climate's very different, and certainly I think you can be much more flexible and move much faster by having your own company and by spinning out and trying to commercialize your ideas. And it's just huge fun doing deals, and I find it, at the moment at least, something that's very different from when I look at my friends who are still in university.
And so I just want to ask, what are the your next big questions? Like, what are the things you want to learn more about? What are the things that sort of keep you up at night? Like, what's that for you now?
Okay. So, well, obviously, I haven't quite solved Alzheimer's yet. That was so getting that on it. I'd like to see NeuroBio really flourish, and get accepted and do so well that I don't have to get in early every morning and push and shove and haggle and harass and do all the things that you have to do in the early stages. That would be nice. So I'd like to see that flourish and for our approach to be proved right. The big question, of course, is consciousness and how the brain generates consciousness. And I would love to have more time to reflect on that. As you'll be aware, I've written books on this. My last one was actually A Day in the Life of the Brain, which was written last year, about a neuroscience approach to consciousness. It's something I've worked on a little bit experimentally as well. So I'd like to have more time to do that. But for me, they're the very big questions. And basically, in a sense, they're the same. They're about the human condition. They're about what makes an individual, why do we want to not have Alzheimer's? What are we going to do if we have clear minds and we're healthy as we age? what is the point of, living in our lives, and what kind of society do we want? And that also includes the mind change questions as well, which is for the first time ever now, compared to previous generations, in our very privileged lives that we live, you and I, we have the opportunity to make those questions like, how do I grow as an individual? How do I define myself as an individual? How do I respect individuality in others? I think there's very important societal questions that stem from that. What kind of education do we want for our kids? What kind of people do we want them to be? What do we mean by a good society? It's not just wine, women, and song, or drugs and sex and rock and roll. It's not just that. That leaves a rather empty time. So I think there's non-obvious questions we should be asking about what kind of society we want to live in. And I think neuroscience can make a contribution to that.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned your recent book. If you have the time, please let me know. Would you mind explaining what that book was about and what your ideas on consciousness are?
That's okay. Yeah. Okay. So very briefly, my idea about consciousness. The problem for scientists is that they like things that are quantifiable and objective, and consciousness is neither of those things. It's something that's quintessentially subjective. And I was reflecting one day that unconsciousness is actually graded. So you're probably aware you have different grades or levels of sleep, and you have different grades or levels of anesthesia. And so I reasoned, if you have unconsciousness graded, then similarly consciousness could be graded as well. And if it was continuously variable, if it could change, if you could have more of it or less of it at different times, then science could have a handle on that, because we could look in the brain for something that varied from moment to moment, that could correlate, that is, match up with different levels of consciousness. We talk about levels of consciousness. We talk about raising our consciousness or deepening our consciousness. It doesn't matter whether you go up or down, but we talk about it in those ways. And if you think about it like that as well, then that does explain the mysteries of, say, animal consciousness, because you could say, yes, a rat is conscious but not as conscious as a dog, and a dog is conscious but not as conscious as a human. And similarly, you could explain the riddle of fetal consciousness. A fetus is conscious but not as conscious as a child, is not as so if one says consciousness grows as brains grow, both phylogenetically and ontogenetically, that's in terms of individuals and also evolution, then you can start to think about it as a property in the brain, or something happening in the brain that varies in degree. And the phenomena that I've worked on experimentally, and which I document and talk about, are the mid-level of brain organization, which is not just single brain cells and not whole brain regions, but the in-between bit where you have very large groups of brain cells working together and then disbanding, a bit like stones in a puddle where you have the ripples. So using that analogy, I then show how that can be applied to the brain, and how one can study these so-called assemblies, these different, ever-changing dynamic coalitions of brain cells. And just to give it a more interesting framework, we start off in the dark, and then you, the reader, wake up, and it's all about, why does an alarm clock wake you up? And then you walk the dog, so what about dog consciousness, and why is being out in nature so good for you? And then breakfast, how do the senses change with your consciousness? And then you go to work, how does the environment affect you? Then you come home, and I'm afraid your wife has got depression, and your mother has got Alzheimer's, and your son's got ADHD. They've all conveniently gone to bed, but it gives a handle to talking about those things. And then you play music and you drink wine. It's about how that affects your consciousness. And then you go to bed and dream. And that's, so basically it's a rather clunky and very, very contrived framework of a day, which I wouldn't wish on anyone, frankly. But it's called A Day in the Life of the Brain. And it brings up, the issues, how far I think we can go understanding consciousness, and where I think there's still the huge intellectual challenge on trying. If I said to you, Jane, while we're talking, I've decided, I know now how the brain generates consciousness, yeah? What would you expect me to show you? Would it be a brain scan or a formula? Or so I don't think we can even conceive of what kind of answer would satisfy that question. Yeah. So that's why we stick with correlate. Yeah, anyway.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And I really appreciate what you said about like scientists, and there's a common conception that creativity and philosophy and religion and these sort of like stereotypically subjective fields play a role in the hard sciences. And like when you compile these facts, and people think that science is all about facts, but it's really like there's a creative way and a way of approaching science.
Yeah,
philosophically.
Yeah. That's why I do it, because it's truly creative. And again, people don't realize this, that actually it's much more like writing a novel or playing or writing a symphony. It's seeing the world in a different way, and it's seeing it in a way that no one else has seen it before. And it's not just like doing a job. It's very different from being, say, a physician or a lawyer, or, where one could job share. You can't be job share in science research, because each scientist will do it in a different way. They'll approach it with different views. Just the same, you couldn't job share writing a novel, or writing a symphony. So it's yours. And that's why people get so defensive about it, and why it's not just like an ordinary job, because it's very much part of you. It's not just you doing a job, It's part of you, part of your life, and you put so much time and effort into it that it means a lot to you, which is why scientists get very upset if they're attacked on the whole, or why they're so vicious about others, because it's more than just automatically rubber stamping or ticking boxes or doing something mechanical. It's not that at all. So that's why it is very important to emphasize that to people. And I think, had someone told me that when I was 16 and hating science, then life might have been very different. Perhaps I'd have been better at chemistry than I was, but and I've done it earlier.
Well, you certainly made effect on this 16-year-old, and I really, really appreciate you speaking today and just sharing with us your stories about your career and your ideas on the work that you're doing. So thank you so much. I think this is going to be really, really helpful for all the girls who will be listening and who are aspiring to be just like you. So thank you again so much for taking the time to do this.
End with, do check out Rita Levi-Montalcini. If you want a real role model, she's the one. she's one. Okay, take care.